Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the 5th Annual Guardian Ad Litem Disability Training Conference. And wanted to make a comment about this conference. We've gotten a lot of feedback through the years. This one is going to go really smooth. We are not having a coach with some of the language that we have sometimes with coaches speak this time, so we will be able to post all our trainings on the website this year. I'm excited about this. In fact, one of the challenges, the way the law was written, is that the money for this conference came out of another budget entity called Justice Administration Commission, and we could only use it if they had a surplus. This is the first year that they are going to have a deficit. But the legislature, Governor Scott, Senate President Negron, and Richard Corcoran thought that this was so important that they moved money over so we could continue to have this conference in the future, because otherwise we would not have been able to continue with these type of conferences. So where the money was, there were deficits and it couldn't happen. Now it is at a place. So not only will I see you today in the next couple days, but I'll see you next year too. So I just wanted to mention that. We are very excited to have all you here and can't wait for you to learn and network with other professionals in your field. To get this conference really kicked off, the Master of Ceremonies, the head legal person for Guardian Ad Litem program, Kelly Schwartz. I've told her to watch her language also, so we could put this online later also.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Alan. And good morning, everyone. I'm going to try and watch my language. I'll do the best I can. So it's so good to see you all here. I have a question for everybody. What's your superpower? Right? That's our theme, right? Everybody here is a superhero, and it's true. So just a little bit of information for you. The Florida Guardian Ad Litem program has exceeded its goal of having 10,000 volunteers. So we have more than 10,000 volunteers in the state of Florida. Absolutely. And these volunteers advocate for abused, neglected, and abandoned children in dependency courts and other courts, in schools, in doctors' offices. They are amazing people, the volunteers, and they don't just stop at advocating in court. They advocate all over. Although most states have a GAL program of some kind, ours is the best. Our success in recruiting and retaining volunteers sets the national standard. And I know that because I co-chair a national committee, so I'm familiar with the other states' programs, and Florida really does a good job of advocating for its kids through the Guardian Ad Litem program. As advocates, we know the best way to get a message across, an idea, a point, is through storytelling, right? So whether it's a fable or a parable that teaches the importance of being honest, stories our parents told us to teach us right from wrong, stories make an impact, right? That's how we get our information. Everybody who knows me knows I'm a big storyteller. I love to tell stories. I have a million more stories from years of being in the courtroom. So we continue to tell stories every day, in the courtroom, at staffings, during recruitment and training exercises, through our annual report. And what we're doing is highlighting the importance of what we do through those stories. We have a keynote tomorrow, so the GAL talk, which features Ian Garlick, Judge Walker, who I saw, and an advocacy team talking about the importance of their stories, how important it was to tell their stories to achieve their goals for kids or whatever your story is about. There's power in telling a story. We educate the community about what we do, who we are, and the importance of our work. And we educate courts. We inspire us. Our stories inspire us and inspire others to do more, to feel more, and to help those who are in need, who need us to advocate for them. In every way, advocates rely on storytellers in the community, whether it's a GAL volunteer talking to a neighbor, right? That's how we get more volunteers. The volunteers talk to their neighbors, people at Publix, wherever they happen to be. An attorney who advocates to meet a child's needs. Storytelling is critical to understanding the needs of Florida's dependent children, and it's essential that storytelling brings to life these kids. So you saw earlier the scrolling pictures of kids. That's how we know who our kids are. When you talk about when you're at staffings and you talk about the kids, you don't really get a sense of who that kid is without the story, right? Their stories are fascinating. Their stories are why we do what we do, to change their story and make them successful. So let me tell you what we're going to do the next 2 days together. We have 20 great workshops and 3 great general sessions. We're asking you to network. Take this time to network. Get to know people, other people from around the state. Get phone numbers. Find out who's a subject matter expert. There's a lot of people here with a lot of information. They might know a little bit something different from what you know. So get their information, and you know who you can call when you have a question. How you can move things through the system, whether it's court or whatever, more quickly. Please use the mobile app. It has the maps, which is important to me because I'm always lost. It has a schedule. It has our materials and contact information. Please, please, please answer the survey. It's how we get better at what we do. We read them, and we pay attention to them, and we change things based on your feedback. So please, please, please answer the survey. It's critical. And then you're going to get another survey after the conference, which is a brief one. Just please take the time. There's just a few questions on that one. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Nico Shea from the GAL Foundation Board, who is presenting the I Am for the Child Award.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nico Shea, and I am a very proud member of the Guardian Ad Litem Foundation Board. Today, I'll be presenting this award on behalf of the Guardian Ad Litem Foundation. Each year, the Foundation and the Guardian Ad Litem program have the honor of working with amazing partners around the state of Florida. This year especially, we've been working with a very inspirational group of people. I'd like to ask Thomasina Moore to come up here and join me on the stage, and I'm going to let Thomasina tell you a little bit more about this amazing group. Thank you, Thomasina.
Thank you, Nico. Good morning. I'm Thomasina, as Nico just told you, and I am Director of Appeals for the Guardian Ad Litem program. In that capacity, I also run a pro bono project called the Defending Best Interest Project. And basically what that title is that we ask volunteers to draft answer briefs in appeals for us in termination of parental rights cases where the judges found that termination is the best interest of the child. And so that's where we got the moniker. I formulated this last June and formally implemented it in July. And as I was formulating it, our goal was to try to get 25 cases handled by pro bono appellate volunteers. I'm really happy to tell you, as of last Friday, we hit 100. Over 2,000 hours of volunteer time. If you take just the average rate of Florida attorneys and calculate that, that's $600,000 worth of work. It's really amazing. And what's more amazing is that 2/3 of that work has been done by one group, and that's the Florida Bar Appellate Practice Section. Last June, I went to a seminar that they were putting on for legal aid and pro bono attorneys. I met Carrie Ann Wozniak, who was the chair at that time of the pro bono subcommittee, and Joe Eagleton, and asked them, could I come and present at the bar conference to your group? I would like to see if we could maybe partner. The reception was immediate and completely 100% in. I was able to go to the executive committee meeting, talk to the members, and they warmly embraced us uniformly. And as I said, since that time, we've had over 60 briefs and 1,200 hours from the appellate practice section alone. So big hands up to them. this time, I'd like to invite Joe Eagleton, who is the current chair of the Appellate Practice Section Pro Bono Committee, and without whose help I could never run this project. He sends out all the briefs I send to him, he hooks me up, and is really a major part of this achievement that we have. And if Kristen Norris is here as well, I'd love for her to come up and say hi. Come on up. This is almost as big as I am, I think. Joe. Joe, thank you so much for everything you guys do.
Thank you. I just want to briefly thank Thomasina for all of her hard work and efforts to put this project together. When she first approached our section about this, our members have always been interested in doing more pro bono work. And this really was an opportunity, as appellate lawyers, we're sometimes a step or two removed from being on the ground and seeing what's really going on in the lives of our clients. And this project really gave us a chance to basically just reinforce the great work that all of you and the Guardian Ad Litem program is doing on the ground level. Because as Thomasina mentioned, these are all cases where the Guardian Ad Litem has essentially prevailed in the trial court, and we're defending that order in the appellate court. And so it's really about reinforcing and upholding what's in the best interests of the child and the great work that all of the Guardian Ad Litem volunteers and office and program is doing at the ground level. And so it's been a really rewarding experience. We're thrilled to partner with you all. We're grateful for Thomasina's effort, and we're looking forward to continuing the partnership. So thank you very much for this honor. It's really appreciated.
The only last thing I'd like to say is we do have several of our volunteers at the conference, and for those of you who are here in the room, Shannon, Tasha, any of you, thank you as well. We really appreciate everything. Thank you.
So thank you, Thomasina and Nico and the Florida Appellate section, the Florida Bar Appellate section. That's amazing. You guys are doing amazing work. Appeals are tough for anybody who's done one. You know that. It's a lot of work. And so we really appreciate everything you're doing for Florida's kids. And at this time, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome back the one, the only, our Executive Director, Alan Abramowitz.
You took my coffee.
I didn't. I wish I had.
The following few moments will not be on caffeine. So, thank you for all coming today. I really appreciate it. Throughout this group, we have parents' attorneys, attorney ad litems, guardian ad litem attorneys, volunteers, agency attorneys, child advocate managers, leadership in different agencies, and I appreciate that you made the journey to Orlando to take part in such a great event where we will become better advocates and learn more from each other about how we can do better. I want to thank you for your continued hard work and dedication to our most vulnerable children. We serve as the voice of more than 39,000 children over the last year, and those children were represented by over 12,000 volunteers this past year. All of you contributed to the success that happened this year. Second, this past year has been amazing. We championed many bills that passed, supported legislation to better the lives of children we serve, and raised awareness of the need for more volunteers and pro bono attorneys, thanks to a grant from National CASA. We were in the movies through Before the movie, they showed I Am for the Child 2-minute videos. We had public service announcements. We had billboards throughout the states. Some of the billboard companies still owe us because the hurricanes knocked some of them down, so there'll be more up in the future. We were on the radio, news stories, proclaiming everywhere, I am for the child. What is your superpower? They say it takes someone getting a message 6 or 7 times before they act on it, so our promotions have created opportunities to allow us to continue to stand up for children by having more and more volunteers. Even this year, when the Supreme Court and the Florida Bar have the Pro Bono Award winner, this year, the Tobias Simon Award, which is the award that you think of when you talk about saving lives, was Stephen Todd from Tampa, an attorney who's a guardian ad litem volunteer. So that was very rewarding because the volunteers do save lives and the attorneys do save lives. Additionally, this legislative session was a great one, and I wanted to talk briefly about the bills that Governor Scott has signed this year. First, the Pro Bono Matters Act of 2018. It was sponsored by Senator Aaron Bean and Representative Frank White. This bill wouldn't have happened without Robert Latham. And one of the things about networking and talking to some of you out there is you learn things. And Robert Latham, who talked to me to the side from, who works at University of Miami's Children and Youth Law Clinic and is a lecturer, he brought to my attention the cost of taking a case pro bono. And it's one thing about volunteering your time, but to end up with a bill of $10,000 or $12,000 or $20,000 to do justice for a child that you needed to advocate for. Before the act passed, the statute only allowed for reimbursement of litigation costs for special needs registry attorneys and not for attorneys doing it pro bono. Now, because of this act, attorneys from the registry in those serving pro bono can bill for litigation costs, and that is a big thing, especially for the law schools. So is Robert here? I know he's speaking, he's lecturing. Well, let's give him a hand anyway. The next bill that we championed was the Engaging Incarcerated Parents, sponsored by Aaron Bean, Senator Bean, and Representative Patricia Williams out of Broward County. Patricia Williams happens to be a foster parent and also a guardian ad litem. It addresses the failure to adequately involve incarcerated parents in their children's case plan. The bill was consistent with current law requiring parental participation in case plan, but now had specific directions to engage these parents. Children have told us time and time again it is important to them, and we wanted to emphasize that ignoring incarcerated parents we do to the detriment of children. I want to thank Candice Brower and the other conflict regional councils, the parents' attorneys, that helped draft that legislation. So I'd like to give a hand to the parents' attorneys. Also, a couple other things I just want to mention, but not get into too much detail because there were a lot of bills. They put in the guardian ad litem budget some dollars for volunteers that travel long distances. Believe it or not, 19% of the children, usually teens in group homes, are not living in the community they were removed from, and normally they're in a faraway circuit. Our volunteers now have some funding so they can continue to be that person in their life and travel to visit them, be it in the Panhandle, at a juvenile justice facility, or in a SIP program, or anywhere, but that can be reimbursed. So that is good news. And also, the Guardian ad litem Foundation was facing sunset, and the lawmakers allowed it to continue its work, but not only did they allow it to continue its work, they removed the sunset forever, so it will exist in perpetuity. So that was good. Another thing is starting January 1st, if a child is 16 in foster care and they get adopted, the adoption subsidy can last till 21. That is big. That is big to ensure those teenagers that there's not an argument against getting adopted. There were many more measures, but lastly, I want to talk about the future of advocacy for children and for parents. There's a Florida Bar Special Committee on Representation of Children and Parents, which is proposing a measure that may be heard by the Board of Governors on May 18th. That's 2 Fridays from now. There will probably be a vote by the Board of Governors. And if they vote to approve it, that would be bar dues being paid for to lobby for a position. The report and final decision are not even done as to this date. It is being placed on the agenda to determine if the Florida Bar will use the dues to advocate for legislative change and advocacy for children and parents. There will be a majority report and there will be a minority report. The measure addresses such things as creating a new state program for attorneys for children and a state quality assurance office to review attorneys' work, as well as eliminating the special needs registry. It also includes new standards unique to children's attorneys for purposes of oversight, monitoring, and discipline, mandated attorneys, and also mandated attorneys for every child by 2020, so every child would have a guardian ad litem and attorney ad litem. I know many of you were left out of the special committee discussions, and it concerns me that the committee made these decisions without including input from those that do the work. Those who in court every day are not the ones who make up this committee. I truly believe that each of you are the experts on what is the best thing for children in advocacy and the best thing for parents in advocacy. I will send an email to all of you for the majority report and the minority report, and all I ask is that you review it and you, as an expert, come to your decision about what should happen, and you will also have your Board of Governor for the circuit, the person you voted for, that you could reach out to. I know the Board of Governors will make a better decision if those doing the work are heard. I do not believe that each of you have been heard. Many of you have told me you did not even know there was a special committee. In the end, no matter what changes are made, you are the ones that will be fighting for children and parents because you have volunteered for this mission to say, I am for the child. Thank you. Kelly.
Thank you, Alan. So at this time, I would like to talk a little bit, just very briefly, about the wonderful partnership we have with Ackerman LLP. And actually, what I'm going to do is let somebody else talk about it. So I would like to welcome up at this time Leslie Schultz-Kinn, the Ackerman representative, who's here to present the Ackerman Impact Award. Thank you, Leslie.
Good morning. Wow, there are a lot of you, a lot of superheroes in this room, and I'm privileged to know some of you. First, on behalf of Ackerman, I want to personally thank you, each and every one of you in this room, who make such a difference in the lives of the most vulnerable children in Florida. And our firm respects you tremendously. And I'll explain a little bit about the commitment that Ackerman has made to this cause, and I think it demonstrates the level of commitment to you and to what you do every day. We are in awe of you, frankly. Thank you for allowing me to introduce the Ackerman Impact Award. Ackerman is a top 100 U.S. law firm with its origins here in Florida. Our nearly 700 attorneys are based in about 20 offices throughout the country, but the majority of our attorneys are here in the state of Florida. The timing of the award being given this week is just perfect because Ackerman has its national campaign going on this week. We call it our Give Back Week, and it's focused on national CASA and guardian ad litem programs throughout the country. And what we do is we raise money in each of our offices. We have our staff and attorneys commit pro bono and volunteerism to guardian ad litem programs, and we really celebrate the work that you do every day and try to support that through all of our offices. Ackerman was the first law firm to partner with National CASA in support of guardian ad litem advocacy, and we have pledged $1 million in funds, in volunteerism, and in pro bono commitments to this cause. Ackerman has also set up a scholarship endowment to support foster youth in their pursuit of higher education. The award is a very important one to the firm because it recognizes a guardian ad litem attorney who has demonstrated exemplary advocacy on behalf of foster children, obviously, but who also demonstrates being an innovative thinker and a tireless worker on behalf of our foster children here in Florida. So it is our privilege to recognize this guardian ad litem attorney. It was a very difficult decision. The candidates were all incredibly outstanding, and I'll turn it back over to Kelly to announce the recipient of this year's award. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Ackerman, for your wonderful partnership with us. So the Ackerman Impact Award is presented annually by the Guardian Ad Litem Executive Director, Alan, and myself, Director of Legal Advocacy. It's named in honor of the Ackerman Law Firm, and it recognizes an outstanding CBI attorney, that's child's best interest attorney, who has demonstrated exemplary legal advocacy and innovative thinking that it has greatly impacted the children that we serve. The award goes to an attorney nominated by the peers, colleagues, staff, volunteers. We get a lot of nominations. This attorney has identified creative legal solutions, large or small in scope, that made an impact on the kids that we served. Contributed to the workplace legal advocacy improvements that support the GAL program, the mission, I am for the child. At this time, I would like to announce the award winner this year is Rochelle Johnson. And as Rochelle's coming up, I'm going to read just a little bit from the nomination that we got. So the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines impact as a powerful or major influence or effect. That's Rochelle. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to recognize Rochelle today. The nomination talks about Rochelle's training that she does. Every time there's volunteer training, she's there. She does a 2.5-hour presentation. Rochelle spends most days in her car and then does work after work. So she drives a 200-mile radius on most days, driving to several counties. She's a very powerful voice for children in court. She's also just a really nice person. She's really, I hear compliments about her all the time from other attorneys that she works with, attorneys who are, I guess we would say, adverse, but they're not, because Rochelle's Rochelle. She accomplishes so much by being kind and professional and knowledgeable. So it's really a pleasure to recognize Rochelle Johnson with the Ackerman Award.
Hi, everyone. I'm much better speaking to a judge than to a crowd, so I'm very nervous, but I just want to take just a few minutes to say thank you so much to all those who nominated me to the Fifth Circuit Guardian ad Litem program under the leadership of Marsha Hilty, to my attorneys that are so fierce and loyal and dedicated, to every child advocate manager that is just so dedicated to this program and so passionate. And I really appreciate being recognized today. I thank God for being able to do this great work, and it is so special to receive this at this time where people are questioning how dynamic we are. So I just want to take the moment to honor each one of you who are in the trenches day in, day out, and telling children how much they matter. We are truly for the child. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Leslie. Rochelle is truly a superhero, as many of you here, all of you here are. So I just want to let you know what we got going on today, the rest of the day. We have Steve Silberman as a keynote speaker. He is an award-winning science writer. His articles have appeared in numerous national media outlets. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Steve in just a minute. We also have a registry attorney panel, which I love. I always look forward to that. So we have several registry attorneys speaking, and Mary Kay Wimsett will be hosting that panel. We have a welcome mix and mingle at 5:30 out by the pool, so please join us out by the pool. It's for everybody. It'll be fun. And then we have tomorrow's general session also, which is GAL Talk, which is, like I said, about the impact and importance of storytelling. So we have a lot of really cool things coming up. We're going to have a lot of fun. So at this time, I want to tell you a little bit about Steve Silberman. I actually had the pleasure of meeting him and having dinner with him last night, and I had a great time. It was great to get to know him. Steve is an award-winning science writer whose articles have appeared in Wired, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Financial Times, Boston Globe, MIT Technology Review, Nature, Salon, Shambhala, Sun, and many other publications. He is the author of Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, which was published by Avery in 2015. Oliver Sacks has called the book a sweeping and penetrating history presented with a rare sympathy and sensitivity. The book became a widely praised bestseller in the United States and the United Kingdom and won the 2015 Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction, a California Book Award, and a Books for a Better Life Award. It was chosen as one of the best books of 2015 by the New York Times, The Economist, the Financial Times, the Boston Globe, The Independent, and many other publications. In April 2016, Steve gave the keynote speech at the United Nations for World Autism Awareness Day. His TED Talk, which I've seen, it's awesome, I love his TED Talk, The Forgotten History of Autism, has been viewed more than 1 million times and translated into 25 languages. Please join me in welcoming Steve Silberman. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great. Good morning to all of you. I'm very, very happy to be here, and I'm grateful to my hosts, Deborah and Kelly, and the rest of the crew at Guardian Ad Litem. And I'm very thankful to you guys who are the real superheroes in this room for the work that you do and for giving me such a warm welcome to Orlando. We're living in a very exciting time. Our society is on the brink of a major transformation in its understanding of cognitive differences like autism, dyslexia, and ADHD. We're evolving from viewing these conditions solely through the lens of pathology, seeing people who have them merely as checklists of deficits and dysfunctions, to viewing these conditions as alternate styles of learning and being with their own distinctive strengths, gifts, and positive attributes, as well as profound challenges. These strengths offer potential boons to our communities, schools, and workplaces, but only if we're able to provide the appropriate education, accommodations, supports, and research. In other words, we're moving from viewing people with these conditions as failed versions of normal to as the autistic industrial designer Temple Grandin says, different, not less. I know this work is not easy, whether you're the parent of an autistic child, a teacher, a clinician, a researcher, a job coach, an attorney or volunteer helping a child navigate through the court system, or a person on the spectrum yourself, or several of these things at once. I know you often feel like you're pushing forward into unmapped territory, groping towards some uncertain future, but I'm here to reassure you that you are not alone. There is a global community mobilizing around the concept of what autistic self-advocates call honoring neurodiversity and emphasizing inclusion and full participation in society for people with learning differences. It's easy to misunderstand the concept of neurodiversity as making light of the very real day-to-day challenges that people with these conditions and their families face, particularly in a society that has barely begun to take up the challenge of providing the appropriate accommodations for people who think differently. In the past 15 years, the United States has spent hundreds of millions of dollars hunting for possible causes of autism in the human genome. In one sense, these researchers have been extraordinarily successful. They found between 600 and 1,000 candidate genes for autism dispersed so widely in the human population that there's no clear biological cutoff point for who is on the spectrum and who isn't. But researchers know that genetics is not the whole story in autism, so they've also identified potential environmental triggers triggers ranging from air pollution to maternal smoking to diabetes to antidepressants in the water supply to too much folic acid. A friend of mine named Emily Willingham, who's an autism mom and a blogger for Forbes, once wrote an exasperated blog post with the title, "This Just In, Being Alive Linked to Autism." Now, I'm a huge fan of science. I would suggest that scientists start looking for more effective treatments to relieve seizures, which are one of the leading causes of death for autistic adults. Other treatments may eventually help relieve chronic anxiety, which is a very common problem in autism. It would also be useful to investigate how reducing bullying in childhood might help cut down on some of that chronic anxiety. But one of the most neglected areas of research is what helps autistic adults lead successful lives. A government report published a couple of years ago revealed that the outlay for research in the United States on improving the lives of autistic adults was less than 2% of the total outlay for autism research and falling. I believe we are not taking conditions like autism seriously as a society until we start treating them as disabilities that have always been part of the human condition, rather than as puzzles to be solved by the next medical breakthrough. The fact that we focus so much on hunting for causes of autism while ignoring the day-to-day needs of autistic people and their families is a scandal. Imagine if society had put off the issue of civil rights until the genetics of race were sorted out, delayed the legalization of gay marriage until the causes of homosexuality were determined, or denied wheelchair users access to public buildings while insisting someday, with the help of science, everyone will walk. Viewed as forms of disability that are relatively common, rather than as baffling medical enigmas, conditions like autism are not so puzzling after all. Designing appropriate forms of support and accommodation is not beyond our capabilities as a society, as the history of the disability rights movement proves. But why haven't we been doing this for autistic people and their families for decades? Why isn't there already an infrastructure in place to help autistic people live up to their full potential and to enable the families of autistic people to sleep at night without worrying about what will happen to their child when they die? Why do people my age, and I'm 60, say that they never heard about autism when they were kids, and now everyone seems obsessed with it? That was one of the questions that led me to write my book, Neurotribes. Now, when people find out that I wrote a 500 and something page history of autism, the first question they usually ask me is if I have a child on the spectrum myself, and I don't. And then if they're really hip, they ask me if I'm on the spectrum myself, and I'm not. The way that I got interested in autism back in the year 2000 was by being on a boat in Alaska with more than 100 computer programmers. The occasion of this unusual excursion was something called a geek cruise. The idea was to have a tech conference in a more interesting place than the Holiday Inn in Pittsburgh, basically. So we were on this boat going up the panhandle of Alaska, which was completely beautiful. And as we were pulling out of port in Vancouver, my shipmates started pulling networking equipment out of their luggage to upgrade the ship's communication systems. By midweek, they had persuaded the captain to give them a tour of the engine room. So these were people who liked to understand how things worked and help make them work better. And sort of the star of the cruise was this guy named Larry Wall, who invented a programming language called Perl, that's sometimes called the Swiss Army knife of systems administrators. Many things that we take for granted today would not have been possible without Perl, like Amazon, the Internet Movie Database, Craigslist. All of these things, particularly in the early days of the web, were made possible by Perl. Perl is also a very eccentric language which reflects the eccentricity of its creator. For instance, sprinkled throughout the source code of the language are quotes from Larry Wall's favorite book, The Lord of the Rings. And every night he would come to dinner in a different neon-colored tuxedo because a tuxedo store near his house had gone out of business, so he was able to get a lot of tuxedos. So it was a wonderful cruise. And as we were pulling back into port, I asked Larry if I could interview him at his house in Silicon Valley. And he said, yeah, sure. I should tell you, we have a profoundly autistic daughter. And at that point, I, like most people, in fact, even like most clinicians and educators, this was back in 2000, remember, believed that autism was very, very rare. In fact, I've had many teachers tell me that if they had an autistic kid in their class, other teachers would tell them, well, really kind of enjoy this opportunity because it's probably the last one you'll ever have. And so it was considered extremely rare. Most of what I knew about autism I had learned from the movie Rain Man, which came out a few years earlier, in which Dustin Hoffman played an autistic adult. I didn't realize until I wrote my book how unusual it was that the movie featured an autistic adult. The whole concept of autistic adulthood was actually still new when Dustin Hoffman played that character. So I didn't think much of it. When I interviewed Larry at his home, his daughter wasn't even there. I did notice that he had made some interesting sensory modifications to the environment of his house. Like he had swapped out a noisy buzzer on his clothes dryer for a little silent light bulb that would light up when the clothes were dry. But I didn't know enough about autism yet to put two and two together. So about 6 months later, I'm writing another profile for Wired of a very technologically adept family in Silicon Valley. The patriarch of the family built the very first computer in the Middle East in the 1940s. And I asked the sister-in-law of the woman I was profiling if I could interview her at home. And she said, yeah, sure. By the way, we have a severely autistic daughter. And I thought, God, that's funny. I thought autism was rare. So the next day in my favorite cafe in San Francisco, where I live, I was telling a friend that exact story about this weird coincidence about these two families that have kids with this rare condition. And this woman at the next table suddenly blurted out, oh my God, do you realize what's going on? And I said, what's going on? And she said, I'm a special education teacher in Silicon Valley. There's an epidemic of autism in Silicon Valley. Something terrible is happening to our children. So, I got the chills. It was a really heavy moment. But because I was a science writer, I also wanted to find out if she was correct. So I wrote a story for Wired called The Geek Syndrome that was about autism in high-tech communities. And it was really the first mainstream news article about autism in high-tech communities. And what I discovered was that even though a lot of people were telling me, oh yes, there's an epidemic and it's caused by electromagnetic waves from all these computers or silicon and chips or something in the water supply, that actually what was probably going on was that parents who were carrying the genes for autism that could actually have the effect of giving you a little boost in certain areas of technology, that if they got together and had a kid, that the kid might be more profoundly autistic. So that article came out in 2001. Unfortunately, right before the article came out, the world had one of its great tragedies, which was the 9/11 attacks. And so I assumed that my article would be completely ignored and overlooked. The opposite happened. In fact, I got email about that article for the next 10 years, almost every week. And these emails were extremely heart-wrenching. They were from autistic people and their families mostly, who were dealing with very difficult basic problems in accessing services. For instance, there were parents who were on a waiting list for 6 months to get their kid a diagnosis. Or there were autistic people who told me time and time again when they were young, they were told that they were a genius, but they'd never been able to have a job in their whole lives because they couldn't make it through a face-to-face interview. Or I would get other letters from autistic people living in poverty, unable to have health care. And these were really just basic problems in human living. Meanwhile, something interesting was happening in that 10-year period, which was the world was becoming obsessed with autism. But it was becoming obsessed with a different question. And the question was, do vaccines cause autism? And so if there was an article in the newspaper about autism, even if it was about like pervasive unemployment among autistic adults, people would dominate the comment section with an angry argument about vaccines. And if you said that vaccines didn't cause autism, you were accused of being a shill for Big Pharma. Now, I was a reporter, a science writer for Wired, who had written about Big Pharma. I knew Big Pharma was not necessarily our friend. They do great things, but they've also done terrible things. There have been significant cover-ups of bad side effects and even death in Big Pharma. So I didn't automatically reject that idea. But I did start to wonder why the concerns of the families who are on the front lines of autism seem to be so different from the concerns of mainstream media, which seemed to be entirely about whether or not vaccines cause autism. And the reason why people thought that there was an epidemic was because if you looked at a graph of estimates of prevalence of autism, in the 1990s, it went like this. This was undeniable. And there were, panicky posts all over the emerging internet featuring this graph. And so I started to think, why don't we know what's causing this? Like if a serious newspaper like the New York Times talked about it, it would say, there's still debate about what's causing this astonishing, rise in prevalence. And I started to think that something was wrong with autism history, that the story, I was very happy when you mentioned earlier about the importance of storytelling. It was really kind of a storytelling problem, I thought. Like, nobody understood why this was happening. Why don't we know this? So in a sense, I went to look for the story that would explain what was going on. And I decided to take 1.5 years off from Wired. That turned into 5 years of 80 hours a week. It turned into an obsession. I thought I was destroying my career. I basically just worked all the time for 5 years. And what I discovered was that the basic timeline of autism's discovery, as it had been reported in thousands of textbooks and Wikipedia, was incorrect. and that if you understood the correct timeline, you had a lot better understanding of why the estimates of prevalence went up. So first I'll tell you the incorrect, the wrong story, and then I'll tell you the right story that I discovered. So the wrong story is that autism was discovered in 1943 by a child psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins Hospital named Leo Kanner. It looks like Kanner, but it's pronounced Connor. And he wrote a paper describing 11 children who were very, very significantly disabled by their autism. They didn't seem to even want to know their own parents. They were sort of shut off in their own world. They didn't seem to want to know anyone or relate to anyone. And in fact, the word autism means like selfism, more or less. So they lived in their own world. And then it was a very well-written paper, and it sort of established the human face of autism for most of the 20th century. And then as kind of a footnote to that paper, this other dude named Hans Asperger wrote a paper that came out a year later describing 4 children who had some gifts as well as impairments, and that was considered a relatively minor contribution compared to Leo Kanner's paper. So that's wrong. This is what really happened. Autism, and in particular what we now call the autism spectrum, was discovered in the mid-1930s at Hans Asperger's clinic in Vienna. The clinic was a very unusual place. It was not like the kind of place where you drop a kid off for a couple of hours of screening tests and then bring them home. It was a place where kids who were kind of at the end of the rope in terms of societal tolerance would live for a month or so. They would be given classes in history and geography. They would write plays together on Sundays and perform them in the garden. It was a very humanitarian place. And Asperger had a couple of assistants named George Frankl and Annie Weiss, who were very, very compassionate clinicians. There was another clinician there named Victorine Zach, who seemed to be able to make an excellent connection with nonverbal kids, and she would lead phys ed sessions in the morning set to music for the kids. And one of the things that they figured out was that if you gave an autistic child the right kind of support, they could excel, although they would always still be autistic. And I'll give you a very vivid example. One of the kids in Asperger's clinic was considered really profoundly autistic. He was very rude socially. He didn't engage in reciprocal social interactions. But when he was 2, he started drawing triangles and circles in the sand, and he became obsessed with geometry. And instead of telling him to stop that, his mom encouraged that interest. And then in middle school, he was considered, his teachers considered him intellectually disabled and incapable of advanced learning, but he kind of badgered them to give him advanced tutoring in math. And he went on to university, where in his freshman year, he detected an error in one of Isaac Newton's proofs. And he went on to become an assistant professor of astronomy. So what Asperger and his colleagues developed was a vision of autism as a lifelong condition that would require lots of support from families and the community, really. And that the special interests of autistic kids, if cultivated and encouraged and supported, could become a life path into a career. That sounds all good. So what happened? Something really bad. In 1938, German soldiers marched into Austria to annex the country for the Nazi fatherland. And in Berlin, eugenics laws were passed to purge hereditary disabilities from the human gene pool. And the Germans mounted an extermination program for disabled children that was the practice run for the Holocaust against the Jews. Asperger's Jewish colleagues had to leave Vienna, like many Jewish people, either had to leave or die. What no one knew, everyone thought that the 2 nearly simultaneous discoveries of autism in American Vienna were completely independent. But what I discovered was that what no one knew was that George Frankl and Annie Weiss were rescued from the Holocaust by Leo Kanner. So when Leo Kanner saw his first autistic patient in 1938, he didn't know what to make of him, a guy named Donald Triplett. And in fact, he wrote in the margins of his notes, schizophrenia? But George Frankl, who had already seen more than 100 autistic kids and young adults at all levels of ability, knew exactly what to make of him. So they weren't two independent discoveries. They were very intimately tied together. But the problem was that Leo Kanner was unable to find George and Annie jobs, permanent jobs at Johns Hopkins. So in their absence, Leo Kanner developed a model of autism that was much narrower, thank you, than the model that Asperger and his colleagues had developed. It was not a spectrum. It was more like a monolith in that Leo Kanner tended to interpret even what you might think of as kind of superpowers as impairments. I'll give you an example. One of Leo Kanner's kids could determine the composer of 18 symphonies, the composers of 18 symphonies, after just hearing a few bars before he was 2 years old. And so Asperger and his colleagues would have said that that was a special gift. In fact, they had a phrase, autistic intelligence, and they would have seen that as a form of autistic intelligence. But Leo Kanner interpreted it differently. He said, what 2-year-old child could possibly be interested in classical music? This is a desperate attempt for the child to earn love from unloving parents. And Leo Kanner ended up being quoted in Time magazine as saying, these children have been raised in a refrigerator that didn't defrost. So in other words, Leo Kanner ended up, even though he initially thought autism was probably genetic, which was what Asperger and his colleagues thought, which is true, Leo Kanner ended up blaming what became known as refrigerator mothers. This was a terrible thing for autistic people and their families for basically the rest of the 20th century. Leo Kanner's approach with an autistic kid was to put them in an institution to remove them from the allegedly toxic family environment. And in the institution, it's not like there were luxurious autism wards for these kids to go to. They were put in psych wards. And there they were subjected to truly grotesque attempts at treatment. For instance, there was a woman at the head of psychiatry at Bellevue, gave a group of autistic kids LSD every day for 6 months until she discovered that it was making them more anxious. I know if I took LSD every day for 6 months, I would be at my wit's end, you know? So, and that was not even the worst of what was being done to these kids. Meanwhile, the parents would be told, A, that they had to be put on a psychoanalyst couch for 10 years to figure out why they hated their children so much. And they were told to quietly remove their children's pictures from the family albums and never speak of them again. So autism became a very shameful thing for families. To admit that you had an autistic child was tantamount to admitting that you were mentally ill. So there was a reason why no one was talking about autism for most of the 20th century. It was considered a family shame because parents were erroneously and horribly blamed for causing their children's autism. Leo Kanner also insisted that autism was very rare. In fact, he once said that he had only seen 150 true cases of autism in his entire career as the world's leading authority on the subject. Well, that was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Leo Kanner believed that white, hyper-ambitious, upper-middle-class, kind of yuppie academic families were disproportionately impacted by autism. It turns out that white, upper-middle-class, hyper-ambitious families had access to Leo Kanner's office, basically. So, and in fact, that got taken so far that in the 1980s, a leading sociologist suggested that black families were immune to autism. It's that they didn't have access to health care and diagnosis. And in fact, I spoke to a woman who started working with autistic kids in the 1940s, so right after Connor claimed to discover it. And she told me that even through the 80s, by the time a family came to her with a kid, they had already seen 10 specialists. So you can imagine how few families could afford to sort of doctor shop their way through 10 specialists to get the kid a diagnosis of autism. So there were a lot of reasons why autism was rare. Another reason is that Leo Kanner would not give a diagnosis to a kid who had seizures. Well, seizures are very common in autism. He had this belief that autistic kids were exceptionally beautiful. Well, some of them are, and some of them look more like me. So he had all these ways of kind of limiting the diagnosis so that it only applied to very certain people. And basically, you could not hardly get a diagnosis of autism unless you knew someone who knew Leo Kanner. And for instance, children of color would hardly ever get an autism diagnosis. They would be diagnosed with what was then called mental retardation, or we now call intellectual disability. So one of the things that's happening underneath this is that the diagnoses of intellectual disability are going down at the same time. That's known as diagnostic substitution. So this was all terrible for autistic people and their families. The reason why Asperger was unknown with his more expansive view of autism is because Kanner never mentioned his paper. And in fact, the only time that he ever did was in the 70s after a lot of stuff, a lot of water was under the bridge. And he said in a dismissive book review, he said, "Oh yes, Asperger, what that person discovered was at best a 42nd cousin of my syndrome and has already received the serious attention of investigators." Well, if I want to give Leo Kanner a positive motivation for suppressing Asperger's work, Leo Kanner was Jewish. He and his wife helped dozens of clinicians escape the Holocaust, including George Frankl and Ani Weiss. Maybe Leo Kanner thought, screw that guy, basically. He was working for the Nazis. So that's a positive motivation. But the problem was, by burying autism, the expansive version of autism in history, Leo Kanner rendered a lot of people who should have gotten a diagnosis invisible. So what happened to make things better? What happened was there was a cognitive psychiatrist in London named Lorna Wing who had a very profoundly disabled daughter named Susie. And Susie, in fact, met Leo Kanner's very strict criteria for autism. But at some point, a public health official came to Lorna and said, "We want to allocate an appropriate number of service providers for an area of London called Camberwell. How many autistic kids are there?" So Lorna and her research assistant, Judith Gould, went into Camberwell and sort of pounded the pavement to find autistic kids wherever they could in schools and clinics. And what they found was, as expected, a very few number of children who met Leo Kanner's extremely strict and narrow criteria. But they found a bunch of other kids who seemed to have bits and pieces of what was known as Kanner syndrome, but didn't behave in the completely antisocial ways that Leo Kanner predicted they would. For instance, these were kids who clearly loved their parents and didn't want to shut them out of their lives and had actually good relationships with their parents, so they would help their mom do the dishes and then go into their room and listen to their favorite record 25 times over. So they had some of the signs of Kanner syndrome, but it was a much broader and more colorful and really more human range of clinical presentations. So Lorna started to think, maybe Leo Kanner's definition of autism is bogus. But instead, she thought about trying to get it thrown out. But instead what she did was, she worked behind the scenes with the editors of the so-called Bibles of Psychiatry, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the International Classification of Diseases to do two things. To add a diagnosis under the autism category known as Asperger syndrome, which would account for kids who talked, because many of Leo Kanner's original kids couldn't talk. They were kids who were not intellectually disabled. In fact, they could be incredibly bright. So that was the new category of Asperger's syndrome. And basically what Lorna and Judith did was they widened the criteria for diagnosis into a spectrum. And one thing that's interesting was that back in Asperger's clinic, Frankel and Weiss and Asperger used to talk about the autistic continuum. And that was the word that Lorna originally used, but she eventually thought continuum sounded like too science fiction-y. So she wanted a more natural sounding word that reminded her of like rainbows. So she chose the word spectrum. And so that's why we have a spectrum. So another thing that happened was that because of that broadening of the diagnostic criteria, the number of diagnoses started going up. For Lorna and Judith, that was really good news. But there were a lot of parents out there who didn't get the memo that the criteria had suddenly been drastically broadened because they weren't reading the autism journals that had very limited circulation because it was mistakenly believed to be so rare. So all this chatter about like, oh, well, we'll broaden the diagnostic criteria, nobody heard that outside of the little bubble of autism clinicians. And so all of a sudden the diagnoses started going up. It was shocking to everyone. And then along came a doctor named Andrew Wakefield, who's no longer a doctor, in England, and he claimed that that was because of vaccines. And I have him on the record saying that he, quote unquote, knew nothing about autism before he ran this bogus study that was eventually retracted because of his conflicts of interest, like the fact that he held a patent on an alternate vaccine formulation and was working with lawyers to file lawsuits against vaccine makers for causing this epidemic. So anyway, it triggered a global panic. But finally, because of Lorna and the broadening of the spectrum, I didn't mention something important. When Lorna started seeing these other kids, sorry about this, when Lorna started seeing these other kids, she didn't know what to make of them. So she was kind of reading around and she saw a reference to this guy, Asperger, who wrote this paper that nobody had ever heard of. And her husband, luckily, spoke German. The paper had never even been translated into English. And so when Lorna and Judith read that paper, they were like, this is what we're seeing in Camberwell. So that's why the diagnosis has the name of Asperger's syndrome, and that's how the spectrum really came out of Asperger's, where Asperger and his colleagues work. So, so that happened. Another thing that happened at the same time, coincidentally, was that the internet was developing. And it turns out that the internet is actually an excellent place for some autistic people to hang out, play, and talk to each other. So for the first time in history, autistic adults could talk to each other about their lives. And there was a mailing list called Independent Living for adults on the autism spectrum. And there was an Australian graduate student whose mom was probably autistic and whose daughter was autistic. At first, she thought her daughter might not be autistic because she didn't seem to have no relationship with her like Leo Connor would have predicted. But then she found out about Asperger's model and thought, well, my daughter probably is autistic. And Judy had a mentor who had survived polio and who lived in a wheelchair. And that mentor started educating Judy Singer in what's called the social model of disability, which says disability is not some flaw or deficit or impairment that is located in the person. It describes a mismatch between the person and society and the accommodations that society is willing to make. And so Judy started thinking of autism as a disability that deserves accommodations, like any other form of physical disability. So Judy started thinking about, well, all the words that autistic people have to describe their lives are kind of automatically pathologizing. I have a syndrome, I have a disorder, I have these impairments. So she thought there should be a word that's kind of, if not positive, kind of neutral. And she thought of the word biodiversity, which in a community of living things, like in the Amazon, it's good if there are more life forms flourishing in a particular region, because it means that that community of living things will be apt to be more resilient in the face of changing conditions. And so she thought, what if there's such a thing in communities of human minds, neurodiversity? What if it's better for society if different types of minds are working together? And so she coined this term, hoping that it would spread through the communities of people with cognitive differences in the same way that slogans like Black is beautiful and gay is good and sisterhood is powerful had spread through other marginalized and stigmatized communities in the 60s and 70s and empowered them. And it worked. The word neurodiversity has taken off, and it allows people with these conditions to appreciate the fact that they have strengths as well as challenges in the world, and that they deserve accommodations. And that it's not just that we have to cure these things, which in the case of autism will be very complicated, if possible at all, because it's such a complex condition. But in the meantime, there are many things that we can do to make the world more neurodiversity friendly. And I'll give you some examples. One of the main problems that autistic people and their families deal with is unemployment, as I mentioned before. There is a shocking 85% unemployment rate among autistic adults. Now, is this because autistic adults have no skills or no motivation? No, they're incredibly motivated. They can be incredibly skilled. They really want to work, a lot of autistic people. But if you look at the standard job interview, it's kind of like a list of things that are really hard for autistic people to do. So it'll be like, make firm eye contact, strong handshake, sell yourself, These things are all really hard, often, for autistic people to do. Also, I live in California, so I live near Silicon Valley, and when I meet these, good-looking, wealthy 20-year-olds, who tell me that their startup is, starting to onboard people, I say, well, what are you looking for in hiring? We're looking for people like us, real team players. Well, autistic people are not team players. That's not their virtue. They see problems from different angles and often see problems that non-autistic people don't see and resist consensus. So that can be kind of annoying, but it can also be a real virtue, and it can make a company more resilient and smarter and more agile in the workplace. And I've been talking with a guy named Jose Velasco, who works for a software, a really giant software company called SAP. And they initiated a program called Autism at Work, and they have committed to hiring tens of thousands of autistic employees in the coming years. They started small with pilot programs in a couple of countries, and it proved to be such a successful effort that they're now scaling up. And Jose was very clear about something very important. He said, we're not talking about charity. We're not doing this because we're nice. We're doing this because it builds value for our stockholders. And what they found at SAP was that if you hire an autistic person, and many of the autistic people that they had been hiring had been unemployed for years, even if they were very highly skilled, that they don't leave and requiring a new employee to be trained, like they're not climbing the social ladder so much. If they get a job that they like, that's good for them, where they're supported and get paid what they're worth, they tend to stick with it. And so it's actually financially more advisable for SAP to emphasize this program. And lots of other companies are now starting to get on board, mostly tech companies still, but I think that's probably because, as I wrote in The Geek Syndrome, the genetics of Silicon Valley are somewhat unusual in that regard. But so Microsoft, Apple, Google, HP, Ernst & Young, all these big companies are now getting hip to the concept of neurodiversity, which was featured in Harvard Business Review a few months ago. Another thing that's happening is that in schools, educators are realizing that an individualized education plan, IEP, should list not just deficits that need remediation, but interests and passions and strengths that can be cultivated, because that turns out to be a very powerful way for an autistic kid to enter the world through their special interest. Leo Kanner, a psychiatrist for most of the 20th century, saw special interests as expressions of pathology, and they were to be discouraged. But now we understand that if you encourage an autistic kid in their special interest, that it can often sort of be scaffolded into a career possibility. And there's a very beautiful movie, I don't know if you saw, movie and book, called Life Animated, about a kid who lost speech. A lot of autistic kids lose their speech at some point in their early years, but then, you know, some of them regain it. And it's a beautiful story of a dad who reconnected with his son through his son's love of all things Disney. So it's a very excellent book. So this is all happening. And I spoke to Jose about how he got involved in doing the Autism at Work program. And he told me an amazing story that will be the last story I will leave you with, and then I'll take some questions. Jose told me that his daughter, Elena, lost her speech when she was about 2 or 3 for a couple of years, but then she regained it. But one day when Elena was about 12, she was driving in the desert in Arizona with her when he suddenly realized that he had forgotten to fill the gas tank. So he looked at the GPS, and the GPS said that the next gas station was 35 miles ahead. They would never make it, and they were in the middle of the desert. And suddenly Elena said, "Don't worry, there's a gas station about 10 miles ahead." And he thought, what? You know, how could she know this, you know? But they had nothing to lose, so they drove 10 miles, and there was like kind of little mom and pop gas station. And what Jose realized was that they had been on that same road while Elena was nonverbal, and she had remembered exactly where the gas station was all these years and was able to then tell him. So that was the kind of experience that convinced Jose to help autistic people gain employment, because only by working with people who think in ways that are not familiar to us will we be able, as a society, to face all kinds of huge challenges that are rushing our way in the 21st century. As Finnish school teachers say, we can't afford to waste a brain. Thank you very much. So I'll be signing books during lunch at that back table there, but does anybody, I should say before I answer questions that alas, I don't know much about guardianship. I want to be honest about that. What I really know about is autism history. But if you have any questions about autism history or anything like that, I'd be happy to answer.
I'd just be interested in your comments on them moving Asperger's from a separate diagnosis to being on the autism spectrum.
That's an excellent question. There was a lot of controversy about that, but I think that most of the controversy was unnecessary. A very honest psychiatrist once told me, the DSM is not really about diagnosis, it's about reimbursement. And the reason why they did that was because depending on where you lived, you could access a very different level of services depending on which diagnosis you got. And the difference in service provided was not always appropriate or helpful to the person. So they folded it into the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, basically so there would be one code, one unified code that you could put on forms, more or less. You know, there's a deeper question, is Asperger's the same, or, you know, what used to be called Asperger's in America, the same condition as somebody who can't talk? That's a very good question. Personally, I don't think so, myself. I think that what we call autism is lots of different conditions that end up presenting in a similar way. Even, you know, there's a point to be made, though. I think people with a lot of those conditions can build common cause together and require the same forms of support and accommodations. So that's good, but is it the same condition at, say, a biological level that would help researchers figure out what causes autism? Probably not. I don't think so. The other thing is that the Asperger's the Asperger's label is going to go away even faster because, as you'll see in the news these days, a scholar has discovered that Asperger did more with the Nazis than people thought. So the word Asperger is beginning to attain a kind of unpleasant, association. But in terms of, is that like kicking people out of the diagnosis? No. And in fact, one of the good things about the DSM-5 that hardly anyone knows is that that decision and a lot of other decisions were made with the advice of autistic adults. It was the first time in history that the DSM subcommittee consulted autistic adults before redesigning the diagnosis. So that's pretty cool. So I'm not against it. I think it's just practical. It helps families access services. Yeah.
In your initial article
Yeah.
about autism in Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
did you find statistical significance, or was there statistical significance between the link between the parents and the child?
Nobody had done studies yet, except for Simon Baron-Cohen had done some very preliminary studies in England. Simon Baron-Cohen, sadly, hardly anybody has really followed up on that, but Simon Baron-Cohen has done a couple of studies since then that suggest that hypothesis is correct, that many autistic children have adults who are engineers or mathematicians or whatever. But it's mostly his work. So I think it would be nice if other people would look into it too. The one thing I will say, and this is purely anecdotal, and it shouldn't be assumed that it's even true, but when I talk in Silicon Valley, there are really a lot of people with autistic traits who have autistic kids in the audience, even more so than when I talk in other places. It does, it's kind of almost common knowledge in the autistic community that there's some connection, but that's not to say that people, who have autistic traits love technology, or that all autistic people love technology. Some people hate it, that's fine. But they do seem to be like fellow travelers in the human gene pool in a way, which is interesting. And that's something, by the way, that even Asperger knew. He wrote about a kid who took refuge from bullies by being mentored by a watchmaker. And he became very interested in that technology. And I found I didn't put it in the book, but I found a reference to a guy in 19th century Europe in some small village who never took part in the social activities of the village, didn't seem to have any friends, lived alone, was thought weird, by the townspeople. But what he did was he kept everyone's drains running perfectly. So I thought, okay, what would technology in late 19th century, Europe? Well, it would be drains, So, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jaquetta Johnson, and as an attorney and guardian for children with disabilities, are there anything, I understand that there's a spectrum, but I have a two-part question. How can we connect and try to ascertain better ways to serve our client or child? And then my second question is, generally in the dependency situation, there's been a disconnect or something disruptive in the home life. How then do the parent may not be a good sense of information on the child.
Right.
So are there other ways for us to identify ways to help our children?
There are. The best way to get information about, what the child might need is to talk to autistic adults. There's a book that came out from a small press, but it's kind of a revolutionary book. It's called The Real Experts, and it was written by autistic adults. And it's basically autistic adults looking back at their own childhood and saying, well, what did we really need and didn't get? Or, what would have really helped us and we didn't get? So The Real Experts is a good book. talking to autistic adults is helpful. There's an excellent organization called the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, that can have speakers come and talk to you, or you can get in touch with them. They're on the web. Autistic adults are not so rare. They're around. And like, you know, it's like anything else. It's like, you know, if you were saying to yourself, like, well, how do we know what women need in the workplace? Well, talk to women, you know? And it's the same thing with autistic people. They can often tell you what the child might be experiencing, like when they do a certain behavior. Like, one of the problems with seeing everything about autism as pathological is that then if the child does a behavior, then you say, well, that's the autism. You know, it's actually response to the environment, you know? So not all autistic behavior is like nonsensical. Like, a lot of it's communication in some way, albeit frustrated or panicked or extremely anxious communication. And so another book I would recommend for understanding kind of unsettling behavior among autistic kids is called Uniquely Human by Barry Prezant. He does a kind of early intervention for autism, and he works with kids with very difficult behavior. But if you read it, it will really change your mental framing around difficult autistic behavior. In terms of if the parents are not a good support system, I know that that's something that you guys are really face every day, probably. It's complex. I don't really know, but if you get a better sense of what autism feels like from the inside, which you can get from talking or reading autistic adults, there's a blog called The Thinking Person's Guide to Autism, or thinkingautism.com. What's great about this blog is that it was put together by parents. Some of those parents, they all have autistic kids. Some of the parents are also autistic themselves, and they feature autistic voices as much as they feature autism parent voices. Like, a lot of the big autism charities, like Autism Speaks particularly, they only in a token way feature autistic voices, you know, but thinkingautism.com has new stuff by autistic adults that really helps you understand what it feels like to go through the world that's not built for you, you know, basically. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I would say like that, yeah.
I have a question over here.
Hi, you had mentioned that employment services would be one of the most important things that you thought should be available to autistic adults. As advocates for children, do you have any suggestions or opinions about the most important interventions that should be made available to children?
Well, I don't like to personally recommend like early interventions because it depends too much on the family preferences and also the ethics of the practitioners in that area. Like, there's some, you know, a lot of autistic people don't like ABA, which is the most common early intervention for autism, and that's because they had very bad experiences with kind of unethical ABA practitioners. There's an alternate early intervention called floor time that I think is very humane, but some people say it's not as scientifically proven as ABA. So I would say that one of the things that we need to do is to, and I hear this from people like Jose who are setting up employment programs, what's lacking is the school to employment pipeline for these kids. And that's because a lot of times the schools are focused on remediating deficits rather than developing talents or special interests or passions. So I feel like there are like several different quantum shifts that have to happen simultaneously. And that's possible. I mean, big social change can happen, you know, in a relatively short time if lots of people are working on different angles of the problem. And so there are a lot of educators now that are starting to realize that they have to start preparing autistic children for employment, just in the same way that they do neurotypical kids. But a lot of that infrastructure is not there yet. So if, you know, obviously, I mean, like, is there a particular thing that you wanted to know, or? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks.
Steve, you tell an amazing story. A suggestion and a question.
Yeah.
Since so many of the population learn things from movies, and you mentioned Rain Man and maybe Beautiful Mind, have you considered a screenplay?
I haven't considered it, but Lorne Michaels of Saturday Night Live optioned the book, and particularly what he optioned was the Asperger chapter. And now that's, you know, he did that a year ago, so I got a tiny, you know, it was, I'm old, so it wasn't like, oh my God, I'm going to Hollywood, you know, like I told my mom to buy a really good dress. No, I didn't. But, you know, so it was like, okay, that's cool, maybe it'll happen, you know.
Well, and your telling of the World War II era story is fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
So just kind of consider that. My question is about public policy.
Yeah.
So if you had a magic wand, you mentioned budgetary allocations or misallocations. What would you do in the public policy arena to change our view and to expand the access?
Well, there's one thing I would do. I mean, I could talk for an hour about that, but there's one thing I would do that's really obvious that very few people think about. Why don't we know how many autistic adults are living in the community without support? We don't know that because we've never done a national survey of that. And that was a national survey of autistic adults was part of Hillary Clinton's autism plan, but that didn't happen. So why don't we know, you know? If we knew, we might learn some interesting things. And in fact, in Britain, a survey like that was done. And lo and behold, what did they discover? They discovered that the prevalence of autism among adults in the community, many of whom had not gotten a diagnosis before the study was done, but then were diagnosed, it's a small enough country that they were actually able to do the diagnosis, that it was the same as the prevalence among kids. And so it's like here you constantly hear about autism epidemic, autism tsunami. Oh, that tsunami is coming. You know, what if there's what if it's a tsunami of recognition? What if there are lots of autistic adults out there without help? Then what you might say is, well, instead of looking for something that's changed in the environment in the last 20 years, you might look for ways to improve the lives of autistic adults. What works? What doesn't work? What's really helpful? What kinds of services can help them make a go of it? What do they really need? Those are questions that we tend not to answer because we don't even know how many autistic adults are out there. And even, you know, like the CDC just issued another estimate of autism prevalence. It was based on school kids. It always is. You know, that's great, but what about all the autistic adults out there? We don't know. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would say that it would be enormously clarifying for us as a society for the need for more research on improving the lives of autistic adults if we knew how many autistic adults are out there and what challenges they're facing. Thanks. Anybody else?
Yes, there's been a lot written as of late about healthy microbiomes.
Yeah.
Have you investigated in any way the link between microbiomes and the day-to-day functioning of people on the spectrum?
I have, somewhat, yes. And it's a complex issue because a lot of autistic people are very picky eaters. So they have, there's like a chicken and egg problem. Like, did the microbiome changes make them autistic, or are they, do they have different microbiomes because they're autistic and live on corn chips, basically? So, a lot of autism parents tell me, well, my son will only eat spaghetti and da-da-da. So you would almost expect them to have unusual microbiomes, I think that's a very promising area of research, but I'm not so interested in it yet, anyway, as a theory of autism causation. Like, I think what we do need to do is to learn how to figure out how autistic kids are feeling, even if they can't tell us. You know what I mean?
And that's kind of my point. Is I know you're not so interested in causation,
right,
but to the extent that it affects their day-to-day functioning is more what I'm focused on.
I agree with you. And I mean, imagine if your tummy hurts all the time and you can't tell anyone, and the only way you have to express that is to act out. You know, I think a lot of autistic kids, particularly nonverbal kids, are in that kind of situation. And, you know, like one of the kids that I write about at length in the book, his mom tried like all kinds of dietary interventions, and none of them really, like, you know, she would think that the behavior was improving because it's been statistically demonstrated that there are very powerful placebo effects in autism. Like if the kid knows that something is different and a lot of people are paying attention to them and the folks seem excited about something, then the behavior will improve, you know? So I think we need to learn how to figure out from behavior, which books like Uniquely Human can help you do, how the kid is feeling. And I think that's a really important thing. There's an excellent, have you read I Contain Multitudes by Ed Young? It's a fantastic book on the microbiome. It's not specifically about autism at all, really, but it's just like, if you want to understand what's going on with the microbiome, Ed Young, Y-O-N-G, I Contain Multitudes. It was one of the best books I read last year. Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Alexa Philistine. I wanted to ask two questions.
Sure.
One is, have you found a relationship between micropreemies or premature babies and autism? And also, as a guardian attorney, I think one of the biggest issues that we face when dealing with autism is the access to services.
Right.
I have a case right now where we have 3 kids who are delayed. I think 1 or 2 of them have been diagnosed with autism, and a behavior analyst is coming into the home 1 time a week for 1 hour for all 3 children. So, which is not
that much.
No,
right?
It's not at all.
Yeah.
So I guess my question would be, how can we better advocate, whether it's through policy, or even in our own backyard? How can we do a better job of getting services in place and more services that are adequate to help these kids function through society?
Well, the first question's easy. Yes, there does seem to be some kind of relationship between premature, really premature babies and autism. I don't know why that is. You know, it's interesting. I mean, another thing, you know, there are some causes of autism that seem solidly proven. Another thing is like problems in the birthing process, basically. The second question is much larger. I mean, I don't know exactly how receptive the lawmakers are here to the changes that you would advocate for. Again, I would say it's good to talk to autistic adults to find out what they're up to and what they think would, you know, help in terms of policy changes. In terms of, I mean, 1 hour a week for 3 kids, that's really not enough. On the other hand, well, you don't have this problem, but there are also parents who like give their kids like 60 hours a week. Of, you know, that can be a little much. Like kids should be able to play, even autistic kids. But obviously those kids are going to need more than that. And part of what can help that is if the people around them, including their advocates, understand what autism is and what the kid is dealing with at a really a moment-to-moment level. Like when I first, could I take 2 minutes to tell a quick little story? One of the best things I did was, for the book, was to attend a conference that was organized by autistic people for autistic people. And it really helped me shed my stereotypes of what autistic people are like. I was one of the few non-autistic people in a group of like 80 autistic adults. And I've never been with a group of more like direct, blunt, honest, no BS, you know. And in fact, the next morning after the first night, I had met some nice guy and talked to him. And then the next morning I saw him in the cafeteria and I said, "Hey, Craig, how did you sleep last night?" And he said, "Why?" That was like a really good question. And then this guy had just been appointed, this guy from the group had just been appointed to the National Council on Disability by President Obama. And so when he arrived at the conference, he was like the big hero. And he walked into the room and this young woman at the back said, "We love you, Ari, if we were capable of feeling such an emotion." So I rid myself of a lot of stereotypes. So it's, it would be good to find out what the policy, like go to the ASAN website and, you know, But I don't know exactly what situation you're facing here locally in terms of what's available. So that's about all I can say. But I wish you luck. You're doing God's work. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. You touched on this briefly with talking about Asperger's no longer being a separate diagnosis, but being part of the spectrum. And I recognize that that gives them more access to the current services, but do you think the broadness of the spectrum is a barrier to getting services because the needs of different individuals are so disparate?
It could be, certainly, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I hear a lot from, mostly from the parents of really profoundly disabled kids, is that our needs are being left behind because the autistic people who can talk are sort of dominating the conversation. Or people think, oh, it's this cute, geeky thing. Like, maybe they don't even need any services. You know, it's like when I get very nervous when like people like Jerry Seinfeld, you know, tell People magazine, oh, I went to see a play on Broadway and I think I'm autistic. Because the problem is when you hear that, you think, well, if Jerry Seinfeld is autistic, why does anybody need services? You know? And so the breadth of the spectrum can be used against autistic people accessing services in a way. Like stereotypes around the breadth of the spectrum or stereotypes around autistic superpowers. Like, it would be good if in media representations of autistic people, it wasn't just quirky geniuses. Like, you know, it would be good. I know that makes for inspirational, you know, TV series, but I know that particularly the parents of profoundly disabled autistic kids often feel kind of left out of the picture. And I understand that, and I think that is a serious problem and probably does influence how much services are committed to that population. So I think the spectrum is good for some things and bad for others. So, yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Not so much a question, but I am a former foster parent, turned adoptive parent, now GAL. And this is for anybody out there in the room. I know you mentioned needing help on a case. When we adopted our two boys, they were profoundly autistic, one in particular, and like the same thing, I couldn't get services for him. And I remember crying with the occupational therapist saying, oh my God, is he gonna be 35 years old eating pizza on my couch? Like, what am I gonna do with this kid that's gonna be bigger than me? Fast forward now, it's been like probably 8 years. And the ABA therapy, we built a team when we were told no. He's now mainstreamed. He's typical. He had every diagnosis against him, intellectually disabled, dyslexia. He's mainstreamed and he's getting straight A's in school. Not that it's about the A's, but.
Yeah.
So 2 things for anyone that needs help, please find me. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. I'm just so passionate about this.
Cool.
Anyone that needs help, I'm in Seminole County. And I will gladly help you, tell you what I did. And the second thing is thank you to all the attorneys out here. Like, your work makes such a difference, and sometimes I feel you don't get to see the end story and how the kids do thrive in many cases. And in our case, the biological mom still stays in touch, and I'm coaching her with her second 2 children.
That's
so
fantastic.
Thank you.
Excellent. That's really an important message, also because one thing that a lot of people don't know, particularly parents of newly diagnosed kids, is that autistic people can really develop later in life. Like, they can develop whole sets of skills, even in middle age, that they didn't have when they were young. And it's really, like, without being unrealistic, it's really important never to give up hope in the individual potential of an autistic person, because I myself have seen, you know, people who couldn't talk eventually start talking, eventually become writers. You know, it's really important that we give autistic people the technology they need to communicate their needs if they're capable of doing that. Yeah, so thank you for doing that, and thank you for giving us that hopeful message.
If there's no others, I have a written question that someone asked me to read.
Sure.
Obviously. Is it appropriate to still use the phrases high functioning or low functioning to describe children on the spectrum?
It's a great question. Everybody uses them except me. and autistic people, they don't like it either. I'll tell you why. In a way, it's kind of, it seems like an obviously okay thing to do because, hey, some autistic people can talk and go to college and other autistic people cannot. But I think that both terms obscure more than they reveal, in that low-functioning autistic people can often become higher functioning if they're in an environment that's not stressing them out, that's not causing sensory overload, where they have access to whatever they need to communicate, where they're in a comfortable situation, where they're getting the support they need, where they're getting support for their executive function so they can do life, which can be learned. And the phrase high functioning also lies in a way, because it takes a lot of energy for high functioning autistic people to seem typical. Like, my autistic friends can, maybe they can go through a day where they're being social because they have to, but then they have to take, a day off because they're so worn out. And so I tend to think that I don't use those phrases. I use the phrases high support needs or low support needs. And support needs, by the way, can change from day to day. It's not like a permanent badge on your soul. It's like, as an autistic friend of mine says, some days are more autistic than others. And you might, by the way, also notice that I use the word autistic. And some people say, shouldn't you be saying with autism? Isn't that better? And I would recommend an essay called Why I Dislike Person-First Language by a guy named Jim Sinclair, who practically invented the autism rights movement. If you ever use the word autistic and somebody says, no, say with autism, he says something like, well, you don't call an athlete someone with athleticism. It's only if something is bad, considered bad, that you try to divorce it from the person. So that's another perspective worth at least listening to. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'll be signing books in the back.
Thanks so much.
So thank you very much to Steve Silberman. And like he said, he's going to be signing books right in the back, right there. There's a poster and a table. And so please stop by and get a book signed. And now it is time for us to go to lunch. So everybody please join us for lunch, and then I'll see you back here this afternoon. Thank you again, Steve.